Hi, we're going to do some elasticity revision. This is good for everybody, I think, in year 10 and 11, just to make sure that you understand the stuff that we did earlier on in the course. So we'll start off with some definitions. Elasticity is all about responsiveness to a change in price. So what happens when the price changes? PED is the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price, and PES is the measure of responsiveness of the quantity supplied to a change in price. And we give these things a number, so it's a numerical measure. The number that we give to elasticity ranges from 0 to infinity. But really we can break it down into 5 categories. So if we've got 0, if the answer is 0, PED or PES is 0, then it's perfectly inelastic. Okay, and if it's between 0 and 1, so 0 point something, then it's relatively inelastic. If it's 1, we call it unitary elasticity or unitary elastic. And between 1 and infinity, it's relatively elastic. So greater than 1 is relatively elastic. But if we get an answer of infinity, then it's perfectly elastic. Okay, focusing on PED. PED is always going to be negative because of the negative correlation between price and the quantity demanded. If PED is 0, so we've got perfect inelasticity, any increase in price will lead to no change in demand. Okay, if PED is 0.5, so that's relatively inelastic, a price rise will cause a relatively small fall in the quantity demanded. And if PED is, for example, minus 1.5, that means that a price rise will cause a relatively large fall in the quantity demanded. You'll notice I've put the minus signs in there. We don't need to put the minus signs in there. We won't lose marks if we just say PED is 0.5 or 1.5. So moving on to PES, we know that there is a positive correlation. So if the price rises, the quantity supplied rises. If the PES is 0, it means that a price rise will cause no change in the quantity supplied, perfectly inelastic. 0.5 price rise will cause a small rise in the quantity supplied, relatively inelastic. And PES of 1.5 means that a price rise will cause a relatively large rise in the quantity supplied because we're relatively price elastic. So we're going to have to calculate PED, and we do that using this formula. PED equals percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. Okay, so we've got quacking ducks on the pond, so always the quantity demanded, or the quantity on the top and the price on the bottom. Okay, so here's an example. 10% increase in price leads to a 5% reduction in the quantity demanded. So we've got 5 over 10, which gives us 0.5, and we know that that's relatively inelastic. And on the second example here, we've got a 6% fall in price, and that's going to lead to a 12% increase in the quantity demanded. So 12 over 6, which equals 2, and that's relatively elastic. Same process now with price elasticity supply. So we use the formula PES equals percentage change in the quantity supplied over percentage change in price. So we've got the quantity on the top and the price on the bottom. So here's our example. A 20% increase in price leads to a 15% increase in supply. That means that we've got a PES figure of 0.75, which is relatively inelastic. And then on the second example, a 12% fall in price leads to a 15% fall in supply. So that gives us a PES figure of 1.25, which is relatively elastic. Just be aware that you might or probably will have to calculate percentage changes yourself. A formula that we're going to be using here, which is you will have been taught in Key Stage 3 Maths, and that is that the percentage change equals the change over the original multiplied by 100. So for example, if we originally had 10 items and then we took away 2, so we changed that by 2, we've got 2 over 10 multiplied by 100, and that's going to give us 20%. So the percentage change was a 20% change. Let's just have a quick look at some diagrams. Here we've got a perfectly inelastic demand curve. It's vertical, the price changes, but the quantity demanded stays exactly the same. This diagram shows a relatively inelastic demand curve. It's very steeply downward sloping, so quite a large change in price there gives us a very small or a relatively small change in the quantity demanded. I'm not trying to be accurate in drawing these diagrams, but just to give a representation of how the diagrams will look. So if we saw a diagram like this, very steep, downward sloping, we know that it's a relatively inelastic demand curve. Relatively elastic here, downward sloping, so we know it's a demand curve, plus it's labelled as a demand curve, and it's quite a shallow slope. So a small change in price has led to a relatively large change in the quantity demanded, so that's relatively elastic. Here we have a perfectly elastic demand curve. It's horizontal. There's only really one price that can be charged, and that's P. The quantity demanded changes independently of the price. It's a peculiar diagram, and you're unlikely to have to use this diagram. Let's go through the supply diagrams now. This is a perfectly inelastic supply curve. Again, it's vertical, so the price can change, but the quantity supplied in this case will stay the same at Q. Relatively inelastic supply is very steeply upward sloping, so quite a large change in the price will lead to just a very small change in the quantity demanded. It's inelastic. Now we've got relatively elastic, quite a shallow slope on our upward sloping supply curve. So quite a small change in the price will lead to a relatively large change in the quantity supplied. So that's relatively elastic. So our final diagram, again, it's a very strange one because we've got a PES with a value of infinity, so we've got perfectly elastic supply. So once again here, the only price that can be charged would be P. If we increase the price at all, supply would fall would rise to infinity, and if we reduce the price at all, it would fall to zero. So the quantity supplied is independent of the price. We need to think about what causes the demand for a particular product to be elastic or inelastic. We call those the determinants of price elasticity of demand. And really, I've kind of got this down to a list of three. First of all, is it a necessity or a luxury? A necessity will tend to have a very low elasticity of demand. We'll buy it even if the price increases, whereas a luxury will be much more elastic. Okay. If there are no close substitutes, we're going to have to buy this thing even if the price rises. If there are lots of substitutes, we would switch to something else. So no close substitutes, inelastic, lots of substitutes, elastic. The time period is also important. We tend not to be able to change our purchasing behaviour in the short term, but we can change in the longer term. So elasticity tends to be relatively low in the short term and relatively high in the longer term. Now let's have a look at the determinants of price elasticity of supply. First of all, can it be stored? If it can't be stored, then we can't release less of it onto the market. We've made it, we've got to put it onto the market. So regardless of the price, we're going to have to release the same amount onto the market. So that'll be relatively inelastic if it can't be stored. Is it easy to increase production? Is it relatively a simple job to get hold of the factors of production that we need in order to make more of this thing? If it is, it's going to be relatively elastic because we can increase output quickly in response to a price rise. Is there any spare capacity in our manufacturing process? If there is no spare capacity, it's going to be very difficult to increase output. If there's unemployment, that kind of links with spare capacity. It means we've got factors which are being unused, so we could increase output. And again, the time period is important. Some things can be issued onto the market or released onto the market quite quickly. Some things take a much longer period of time. So for example, agricultural output, which takes a long time to grow and prepare for market, that might be relatively inelastic because it takes so long to get the supply to the market. Folks, I hope you found that helpful. I haven't done any application work there. You need to go and find some questions and make sure that you can put the knowledge that's on this PowerPoint into practice. Okay, good luck.